So this is part 5 of our Age of Rage series. And actually, it's happening today on World Mental Health Day. So I thought it would seem appropriate to have my friend and psychologist Geri Fitch come and join us today to talk about anger from maybe a slightly different angle. But first, Geri, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you too, David.
And it is Thanksgiving, but it's probably one of the more unique Thanksgivings and unique falls actually for us this year. You know, often at this time of year we're having fun with family and friends and looking for what parties we're going to, and a bit of fun, a bit of fellowship, but a little different this year, huh?
And it often is a time of anticipating and expecting good things to happen, but it's always a time that triggers remembering new and old losses, adjusting to inevitable changes, and adapting to relationship shifts. This kind of coming together for a holiday like this brings expected and unexpected stress. And with stress brings the potential for anger to be present. Our own anger as well as others' anger that we connect to and we care about. And anger between those we're connected to is easily misunderstood and not a topic people want to engage in addressing.
And it's almost like we're all kind of aware of the fact that whenever there's a big family gathering, there's the potential for some sort of anger, but we don't really often know what to do with it. And that kind of leads me into what I want to talk with you about today. What we've often done throughout this series is we've thought about sort of political and economic and cultural and these types of anger, but I want to move to discuss today some of the challenges with anger, in our own personal lives, perhaps with a friend or a close family member or even a colleague, perhaps. So Geri, we know that anger isn't as simple as many of the stereotypes, just slamming doors or an intimidating conversation or piece of communication somewhere. But having you with us as a professional psychologist, I suppose the question I want to begin with today is, could you give us some important facts that would help us understand anger a little bit?
Sure. Well, anger is a multifaceted emotion. It can be found in any temperament, whether you're shy or whether you're extroverted. And expressions of anger can be not just those obvious ones, but frustration, irritability, annoyance, fretting, fear, self-pity. All of those kinds of reactions are tied to anger. And then anger is something that often overrides reason when it shows up, and it can frequently lead to terrible decisions which can hurt ourselves when we're angry and others who are witnessing it. But the thing about anger is it is rather purposeful. It is a form of power, and it can be used to pursue or provoke or shame or blame or subdue others in order to be right or to win, or to get what is perceived as entitled or fair, or at times for self-protection. I think the thing to remember about the emotion of anger is anger begets anger. It's catchy, whether you're the person that introduces it or you're the person that's responding to it.
And so, thinking about that, I think many of us perhaps would relate to being taught, or we've been led to believe, or perhaps even we just assume, that that feeling angry or expressing your anger isn't a healthy thing. And within Christian circles, even it's sort of categorized, it's sinful and therefore should be suppressed or at very least ignored. Could you sort of unpack for us, or perhaps give us some insight into what is unhealthy anger?
Well, there are at least 3 clinical types of unhealthy anger. But the most common that we are familiar with are aggressive anger and passive-aggressive anger. Aggressive anger expresses itself in explosiveness, in rage, intimidation, and blame. But it can also include things like bickering, criticism, griping, and sarcasm. Aggressive anger is actually aimed at meeting personal needs and therefore tends to show insensitivity to the needs of others.
And I mean, that That's really interesting, because I'm sure there's more than a few of us who will hear something like that and recognize some of those things as anger, but probably, there's a couple of things you just mentioned there that we'd go, oh, that's anger too. But so that's aggressive anger, but could you give us some examples of how somebody might encounter passive-aggressive anger?
Well, before I do that, let me talk about the idea of aggression when it comes to the emotion of anger. We recognize that aggression levels increase as voice level rises and as physical distance decreases. So expressions of aggressive anger might be, you'd say, fine then, have it your own way.
Okay.
Or, I am so done.
Right.
Or, I'm fed up with you. Or how about this one? I quit. Or you're just like your mother or your father, or just some that get really intense, like I just can't stand the sight of you. Or sarcasm. Really? That's how you're going to play this? Or the obvious, which is swearing.
Right, okay.
So then there is passive-aggressive anger, and those behaviors and phrases are just as damaging to relationships, but kind of seem more acceptable. The difference is they're aimed at preserving your personal worth and needs and convictions, but they're accomplished by having control and maintaining personal safety with the least amount of personal vulnerability. And so that's how it uses subtle sabotage tactics. But either way, it perpetuates unwanted present and future tensions. So they both lead to the same outcome.
And so perhaps, what would be some examples then of that sort of passive-aggressive thing in real-life situations?
Sure, and one of my favorites that I tend to use, when someone asks me if I'm frustrated, because I'm a fairly expressive person in my not only my voice, but my nonverbals, I'll lie and say, no, everything's just fine.
Right, okay.
Sulking and pouting are other examples.
Right, okay.
But here's some: procrastination when you don't want to do something, or approaching projects or tasks kind of half-heartedly, or sarcasm. But here's another one: complaining about others behind their backs.
And like for me, Geri, this is fascinating because, again, you're listing through these things, and I recognize these things, and in one sense, I recognize myself doing all of those things, but I don't know that I ever categorize them as anger. I would categorize them perhaps as something else, but really interesting to say, okay, yeah, this is actually perhaps how anger is, working its way out in me. Now, you and I have talked a lot, behind the scenes and in lead up to many conversations that you and I have had, and I think we're on the same page when it comes to the fact that we acknowledge that anger is, it's a God-given human emotion, and we see examples of it in Jesus' life and teachings and in his behaviors. But when people experience anger in relationships, with themselves and others, what do they need to, ask this question, what do they need to know to understand and manage their response to anger?
Yeah, okay. So an important thing to recognize about that emotion that is part of who we are is that anger is an instinctive, arousal-pushed fight or flight response to threat or frustration, either of you or of others' goals and desires. This is how we were designed by God to actually help us survive. But when it comes to anger, we do have the human capacity for choice and control when we experience it, as opposed to people say, I don't know what happened, it just came over me and there was nothing I could do, which is interesting, but we do have choice and we do have the ability to control it when it shows up.
All the time, you think? So we always have that choice?
Yep.
Right, okay. Wow.
How we recognize and manage anger well is connected to deliberately learning our personal boundaries, to training ourselves. When we train ourselves, that actually trains people who are with us who have difficulty. We have to train our internal self-talk, and we have to manage and master impulse control. We have to learn to regulate emotion. So while anger impulse control is typically modeled and learned when we're young, it does continue to be something that has to be practiced and relearned through our entire relationship lives. So when people sometimes say, well, I'm not angry, when I'm with my friends or my boss, but when I'm at home, man, I don't know what happens. It just gets the better of me. So certain situations are going to push it differently than others.
Yeah, and I mean, I pushed you a little bit on that question back there because I almost wanted to hear that again, that sense of, you always have this choice because, so many of us, our engagement with notions of anger, there is a point where we feel like once that point's crossed, it's just like a roller coaster. You go over the top and now this is just what happens and there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Right.
And so if anger is an inevitable human emotional response to our own or others' aggressive or passive-aggressive pursuits, like how do we respond in a healthy way in that sort of situation? Or perhaps a different way to ask the question, how do we show mercy in the face of escalating intensity, emotional pursuit, or even deliberate anger?
Well, in the time we have, it's a longer teaching than we can do, but it does involve learning and then expressing assertive anger responses. Note I said assertive, not aggressive or passive-aggressive.
Okay. And now I'm interested in that based on our teaching in the last video where we were thinking about how do we not be violent or passive, so I love that word assertive.
And the assertiveness has to be relevant to the anger situation that you're in.
Of course.
And it has to be aimed at preserving your personal worth and your needs and your convictions, while also considering the needs and feelings of others. So the goal in expressing assertive anger is not to win. And it's not about being right. It's actually to help relationships grow with personal maturity and to create stability so that the relationship continues. And it's learned through understanding and setting personal boundaries, learning how to decide, well, what is my yes or my no response to when others are making demands on me? And then it's about role-playing how to express them and deflect and exit if the people that are getting very angry and escalating things continue to pursue their agendas. So an operative word here is pursuit. And when you're being constantly pursued and the other person has a stronger will than you do, you have to know how you're going to respond, especially if you don't know what your yes and no is in the moment.
And this is really interesting for me, Geri, because of like earlier on in this series, one of the things that I found really fascinating as I was researching for this series is this notion of anger as often being something triggered by boundary crossing. Like I have a perceived boundary and you cross it. And this is really helpful advice because what you're saying is, okay, well, if I'm understanding you correctly, that boundary is going to be crossed. Somebody's going to pursue crossing that boundary. And so it's one thing to say, here's my boundary, and as long as you don't cross it, I won't get mad. But likely in an interpersonal relationship, somebody's going to push over that someday. And now I need a strategy to what happens if and when, if I'm understanding you, correctly in that. And then so I then, with that kind of question about strategy in mind, I kind of want to just reverse back to the first teaching in this series when we talked about this like fascinating scene from John chapter 8. So in chapter 8 and verse 1 to 11, and people can go back and listen to part 1 of the series if they want, but you have this story where Jesus is involved in a teaching moment, and while involved in this teaching moment, some teachers of the law and some Pharisees, they bring this woman that the text tells us has been caught in the act of adultery, and they drag this woman before Jesus, and essentially they confront Jesus about like, what do you think we should do in this sort of situation? And John tells us, like, the whole scene is a setup. Like, they just want to trap Jesus. They want Jesus to basically either go against Moses' law or go against Roman law. And either way, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they win because they can go, well, you can't break the Roman law, they're in charge, or you can't break Moses' law, you're supposed to be a Jewish teacher. And they think they've got Jesus brilliantly trapped. And we learn, once again, that it's probably never a great idea to attempt to out-argue Jesus.
Yeah.
And so there's this moment where Jesus, instead of reacting, he starts writing in the ground, but just makes this comment to everybody, well, if you don't have any sin, you can throw the first stone and begin the execution of this woman. And you know, the story ends, everybody slowly drifts away. In talking to you after we did that, after I did that teaching at part one, I felt that you had some really important sort of additional insights that you see Jesus and how he responds to this very tense and anger-filled situation that I think you think is quite key in how we then go about responding to it. So Jesus becomes, not unsurprisingly, again, a model for us to navigate sort of our relationship. So I wondered if you might want to elaborate back on that story for me for a moment.
Sure. I do love this story because it's a powerful role model that shows multiple expressions of anger going on at many levels from different characters. And it also evokes in me anger, just like you talked about. Where's the guilty guy who was also involved in this woman's behavior? But that's another story for another time.
Yes.
But what Jesus did at this point is he actually takes a time out. And there are lots of ways to manage anger in terms of role-playing, anticipating, knowing your boundaries. But when you don't know, when it catches you by surprise, or when it's the same old, a tried and true response is a timeout. And you use a timeout to think and formulate your response because you don't always know. And sometimes it's evolving even as you're there. So Jesus uses this tactic brilliantly to de-escalate the angry mob. He protected the safety of the adulteress. He preserved his own convictions. And he modeled and invited relationship maturity and created stability. All within the context of what was going on that he couldn't prepare for.
Yes.
Yeah. I imagine that he did this in the timeout by slowing down, breathing, looking down and writing on the ground, not being intimidated by not watching others' nonverbal taunting that must have been going on, and taking whatever time he felt was realistic to formulate his response. Then he waits. Then he gives an assertive statement. Whoever of you is without sin, cast the first stone. And he does it in the way of a reflective invitation, not a pursuit, not sarcasm. Then he waits some more. That must have been phenomenal. We read it so fast, but I wonder how long it took for just this silence of people to have to respond and then to actually exit. It must have been pretty powerful.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, so I'm with you. The scene is like this. It's a phenomenal story in so many levels. And one of the things that I have always loved about Scripture is that you can take a story, and I can give that story to an expert in Jewish law. And they will go, this is really clever the way that Jesus navigates this. And I can give it to a contextual historian, and he'll point out all of the errors that are going on in the scene and how they're really setting Jesus up. But one of the things I love about the Bible is then you can also go, hey, here, let me give this text to a psychologist. What do you see here? And and you don't come back to me and go, interesting, the engagement with Jewish law, or interesting how what was going on in Rome at the time was that you weren't allowed to stone somebody in the street. What you do is you go, wow, Jesus is taking a time out. Like he's doing something that, in your clinic sessions, you're recommending people do on a regular basis. And you're now saying, wow, look, Jesus is sort of putting this into play. And so ultimately what he ends up with is a strategy that's powerful for managing his own anger. But what I think is interesting, if I hear you correctly again in this, is that not only is he managing then his own anger, but he's managing the anger of those who were the bystanders, and also with this group of people who are confronting him.
And pursuing. What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah. So the idea of Jesus waiting forced his accusers to have to take a timeout as well as him.
Yes. So everybody's on a timeout in this situation.
Yeah. So it's a strong strategic example of an assertive, effective response to being pursued by anger, either in yourself, as you're reacting to someone pursuing you, or the others. But it definitely requires self-control and courage, and not going too quickly.
Yes.
So essentially, in asserting and taking a time out, so we'll take it away from Jesus here, but just say, what are you really trying to do in a time out is using some humility and control and courage and basically saying, look, for whatever reason, right or wrong, I'm about to lose it. If I stay here and keep this up with you, I'm liable to do or say something stupid or mean that I know I'm going to regret. So therefore, I'm taking a break to get a grip on myself and calm down. And then I'm going to check back in with you responsibly. Now, that's not always what's said, but that's the idea of what it is you're trying to do by stepping away. And there's some basic timeout steps that need to be followed depending on if you're the person that calls it or if someone calls it on you. And then we can use lots of sports analogies where that's built in to not allowing things to get out of control in sports events. The thing that happens within anger is when I call a time out, in however the finessed way I do it, I have to be able to avoid the other person or people feeling abandoned. Because when they experience that at times, it escalates their pursuit to continue because they don't want to be left or abandoned. That creates more anxiety, therefore more anger. So the rule is typically the person who calls the timeout sets the expectation and the time to re-engage and takes the responsibility to initiate the follow-through. And this is where I think people who take timeouts don't do it well in the end because it just is seen as, well, maybe I'll come back and chat with you and maybe I won't.
Right, okay. So do you mind if I just, so let me put that into, so you and me are having an argument, okay?
Yep.
And I can feel, okay, I'm gonna lose it in a minute. So what, if I put it into a real life context, what you're looking is for me to say, okay, listen, we need to take a time out here because I think I'm gonna lose the plot in just a minute. So can we take an hour and then let's pick this back up again? Or can we take a day, or can we take 5 minutes? But then you're saying it would be my responsibility to then come back and go, okay, the hour has gone, I'm feeling like I'm a little bit more in control, let's pick this back up again. Would that be an articulation of what you're getting at?
Absolutely. The fly in the ointment here is if you're not angry, but I am, and I'm not controlling what's going on with the pursuit, is you get to call a timeout, but you don't do it in such a way that says, look, you're really angry, we have to stop this right now. You just simply create an assertive response, which is, I need to take a break. Okay. And actually, I wouldn't even ask if somebody is being aggressive and pursuing to you. I wouldn't say, can we take a time out? I'd say, hey, I'm going to take a break here, and you are asserting it, not asking for it, if the other person is escalating and angry.
Right, okay, wow.
And the other thing is, it's not your responsibility to help the other person calm down, only to help calm yourself in response to it so that you can begin to think clearly about what you want to do next. And the time that you take allows you to pray, to repent of your own pride that might now be in play accidentally or on purpose when you start to recognize it. Yes. So the slowing down helps you to think about, what's my part in this? And then during your time out, you formulate 3 clear messages that you want to know about yourself and then relay to the other person. And it's an I message. So, I think, I feel, I want. And in your time out, you role play and practice how you're going to say that to the other people.
And so these three things are going to help me connect better with why it is that either I'm about to lose the plot or how I'm feeling in reaction to you becoming angry with me or something.
And what I need.
Yes, okay, yeah.
What I need in response to it. So when the anger has subsided, assuming it has, and if it hasn't, you take another time out.
Right, okay.
you're doing is you're remembering and reframing what also might be part of or triggering the bigger anger story that you might be in. So in a family, when you're sitting in an event and there's all sorts of past triggers that are now kind of playing into this, you kind of want to remember, how did this go down last time? What else might be going on here? So what's my role in diffusing that or in inviting a break?
Yeah.
Other times you have to forgive yourself and the other for your part in the conflict. So sometimes coming back is saying something like, I'm sorry we were fighting. I'm sorry that anger got in the way of our conversation. You're not admitting to right or wrong. You're just acknowledging that anger was a part of it. And I'm sorry that we were fighting. You then want to resolve to move towards with a heart to repair, not a heart to win, not a heart to be more logical or to manipulate or to talk someone into something. So the idea is plan to listen to the other person's response. And then when they've responded, you just simply summarize or clarify what you heard them say, not go back to, and here's my argument. It's, here's what I heard you say.
And again, I'm kind of hearing, and something that I've wondered about quite regularly when it comes to sort of issues of anger is that there's almost, let me think of a really bad way to say this, but almost there's a way of being right but wrong, you know, and it strikes me that in a lot of anger conversations, once anger takes over, it actually almost seems to become irrelevant whether I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right and I'm wrong. And you even see that in the situation with Jesus. Like, the anger's driving this whole story so much that really the woman, and hear me correctly when I say this, almost becomes irrelevant to the story. The fact that they've caught her doing something they think is wrong almost doesn't matter anymore. Rage has just taken over, and people are holding rocks and everything like that. So I really like the way you phrase that.
But there are people who part of how they deal with anger is, if I can just get you to hear me out, you'll agree with me and I'll win and it'll all be fine, because it's really quite logical from the way I see it. But they don't know actually the other pieces that are going on in the interaction and the escalation and the pursuit that really aren't about logic and winning.
But I found that, though, that sense of, you know, that pursuit of, well, you know, if I just really get mad, you'll realize that I'm right. Well, maybe you are right, and by the end I'll admit, oh yeah, you are right. The apology is still necessary, because the way that we went about doing that was harmful. I think that.
And I think when you try to think about how you want to use a timeout to protect yourself or give yourself a chance to figure out what's going on, is always be prepared that the other person who is still angry or frustrated is going to throw a verbal grenade at you as you're trying to leave. And the idea is, don't respond. Keep moving towards the goal that you've already set versus, you know, getting pursued again and then getting caught in the same cycle. So you actually have to exit.
And that to me just... just really, really helpful advice across the board in that sense. And I love, and this is why I still wanted to have this conversation with you, where you know, you hear my sermon at the start of this teaching series, and you know, and then you're like, hey, there's some other stuff that I'd love to add to that, and I think we could build on. And so what I'm really grateful for is the strategy that you've kind of laid out for us today. And I'd encourage, you know, anyone engaging with the conversation to think about re-listening to this, because there's a kind of step-by-step, in one sense rooted in what we see Jesus doing, but actually eminently practical in our day-to-day lives, that we don't need to think of our anger as the kind of top arc of the roller coaster, that then it goes and, hey, we're all in this. You know, my daughter, and we took her to Disneyland for the first time last year, and there was a moment when she was at the top at one of the roller coasters that she decided, yeah, this was a bad plan. But it's too late now at that point. And now she's braver than me, because it was just her and Mom that were on it. I was in Starbucks somewhere, you know. But I love what you're saying is almost both rooted in Jesus, but then in your professional practice as a psychologist, that there is a way to change the paradigm of how we think about anger, and that is something that you can choose. And by even something and I mean this complimentarily, even something as simple as a timeout. You know, it actually, on paper, you think, well, that kind of makes sense, and we can see how that works.
Well, and part of people who have lived in this kind of challenge of anger in intimate relationships is them actually role-playing with somebody who's safe, like me, and just, well, what do I do when this happens? Well, what if this happens? Because this usually happens. And it is about role-playing, okay. So how do you reconnect to the timeout, or how do you understand how you're going to respond? Because there's often a pattern to how you're being pursued. Same old stuff.
Yes.
And you get triggered, and then stuff gets said. And it really is, so what happens when this happens?
Yeah.
And often it's just go back to step one and repeat, I think, I feel, I want.
Yes.
And not go down rabbit trails of logic, because they just take you to the same end of frustration. Yeah.
And there's a sense in which anger is not hugely creative, so it does keep going around the same
It's a loop.
circles. Yeah.
Yeah, and you keep doing the same thing, and they
Yes.
keep doing the same thing, and it's the same result.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, which makes it tricky.
Well, Geri, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I mean, I massively appreciate your insights, and for anyone that's engaging with this sort of 5 parts of the series, hopefully there's a sort of trajectory of the series from the conceptual and the biblical, and the theoretical right down to today, which becomes very, very practical. So thank you so much for
It's my pleasure.
engaging
My
with
pleasure.
that. I encourage all of us that are sort of working within this series to think about the various examples that we see as ways of us having strategies to navigate the inevitable sense that we're going to get angry at something in some way with someone. So I hope you connect with this and find it helpful. And as always, until we see again, may God's grace and peace be with you.